Hi, Fred.
Alrighty, well, let's get started. Good morning and welcome everyone. So my name is Kelly Knudsen, he, him. I'm the state policy manager with the Coalition of the Delaware River Watershed. Thank you all for joining. Since we have a small group, feel free to drop your name and organization in the chat box along with your preferred pronouns if you feel comfortable. So today is a continuation of our discussion of the Coalition's 2021 Delaware priorities and just updating them to reflect advocacy and partnerships for the year ahead. And our focus for the next hour will be around wild and scenic rivers. And in the state of Delaware, the Coalition has committed to explore opportunities to amplify and coordinate efforts with Partnership Wild and Scenic. So throughout our conversation today, we'll refine what role the Coalition can play in local designations, as well as identifying what support or resource development is needed moving forward. So we're fortunate to have Sarah Bursky from the National Park Service on the line, who will later speak about White Clay Creek designations, which is an example of the partnership in Delaware. So she'll also detail the designation process for us as well. So hopefully by the end of our discussion, CDRW will have clarity on strategy for wild and scenic designations in Delaware, along with understanding what supporting role will play throughout the upcoming year. So on the last call that we held with Delaware members, we discussed the Coalition acting as a convener, which led to this discussion amongst stakeholders about designations to pursue. So again, thank you all for being here and look forward to that continuing conversation ahead. And throughout our call, and especially towards the end, we'll have an open dialogue. And we'd love to hear from you all on the possibilities that exist within Delaware for wild and scenic rivers. But before I turn it over to Sarah at MPS, I'd just like to recap the Coalition's federal advocacy on wild and scenic rivers, which has been a watershed-wide adopted priority for us for a couple years now. So for FY22, we've requested a continued level of funding for the program at $3.925 million. And within the Delaware River watershed alone, there's 400 miles of designated wild and scenic rivers, which, as many of you know, includes White Clay Creek in Delaware. So continued federal funds that will ensure effective and efficient implementation of approved conservation plans and long-term protection of these designated waterways. So this request was included in the Coalition's 9 appropriation and legislative asks during Virtual Hill Week with members of Congress in DC to advance our federal clean water and land priorities. And during a kickoff event, we invited Senator Coons, who spoke really highly of White Clay Creek in his remarks. So we're also excited by the administration, especially with leadership of Joe Biden, who was a Senate sponsor for White Clay Creek designation as well. So in Delaware, there's definitely excitement and opportunities on the local level to complement our overarching federal ask. So we look forward to working together and enacting more successes on the ground in Delaware. So with that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Sarah Bursky from the National Park Service to speak about White Clay Creek. So take it away, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be here. Can I just check that I'm not freezing up at all? Is my video going pretty good?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Sometimes I have to turn off incoming video to have the feed that I want. So I appreciate being invited. I know that ideally you would have had Shane Morgan here, who is the local coordinator for White Clay Creek. I'm looking in the audience here. My colleague Paul Kenny is here, who manages and administers 3 different rivers. Fred Akers is here. Fred does a tremendous amount of work with the newly cemented coalition of partners. Kelly asked me to speak a little bit about the benefits of designation and then to speak a little bit about the process, but there really is so much knowledge right here in this room. So I'm going to assume a lot of familiarity with some of the more technical pieces and really fly through the slides. I've got some pictures from Shane. We can talk specifically about White Clay Creek to the extent that I'm the expert on it, which I'm really not, Shane is, and then really get to the discussion. It sounds like you want to dig into some strategy, and I think there's a lot of knowledge in-house. I should note Jerry Kaufman, who's here, who's very involved with White Clay Creek, so there's just so much knowledge in the group. But I did come with a few slides for you. So let me get that going. Sorry, I was going to start sort of mid-presentation, but we'll move through just a couple of things really quickly here. Everyone have a good look here. So I think, as you all know, really we're talking about today the Partnership Wild and Scenic designation, which is a model that evolved under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act more recently.
Excuse me, Sarah, are we supposed to be seeing slides at this point? Are you doing a screen share?
Yes, thank you for.
Absolutely. I've done it on several occasions myself.
I had clicked it, but maybe I hit it too fast. Let's try again here. Are you seeing that now, Em?
Perfect.
I appreciate it. So the act, of course, passed in 1968 at the same time as some of our major environmental legislation in this country to protect free-flowing rivers. Move through that. It's really fun to think about the development of the partnership model coming from this region in particular, beginning with a version of it in Upper Delaware that involved a role for local communities. And then Fred could tell you all about the development of Great Eggs Wild and Scenic designation. And we think about that as the first true partnership river model. So what do I mean by Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers? Is this more collaborative approach of wild and scenic designation? As I said, I'm not going to go too much into the technical pieces of it, but a section of it authorizes the funding that flows through the National Park Service to the partners and stakeholders in the watershed. And it is still a subset of the overall wild and scenic river system. So those pieces are significant. That last dot there about the study, we're going to talk a little bit more about, obviously, later on. So we like to really distinguish this partnership model from the more traditional wild and scenic river designations that really started out west with some of the really large rivers that you think of as iconic. And so it's this locally led partnership. And some of you here on this call today could really write the book on that. But feel free to ask me more questions as we go along. So as I mentioned, Kelly asked me to talk about the benefits, in a general sense. Here are some slides of the range of impacts that the partnership model has had in the region. New public canoe access on the Lamprey in New Hampshire, dam removal on the Musconetcong. Alan Hunt and Paul, who's on the call, could tell you all about that. Youth education, the annual solstice celebration on the Sudbury, Assabet, and Concord in Massachusetts, wildlife protection on the Wekiva, which is our one partnership river down south in Florida, and land preservation on the Great Egg. I think that's one of Fred's slides. So one of the keys of the benefits of partnership river designation is that in the process of the study, which I think we're going to talk more about, is this management plan that's developed. And it really becomes the community resource, the sort of collective brain of watershed protection. And regardless of where the study goes, that is a product that is very valuable in the region. Of course, we hope the designation provides recognition and prestige, similar to a national park might in your communities, an economic boost in terms of that recognition. There's a technical aspect that comes with it being designated under the Act, which is the review of development projects. Anything that is a water resource project that has federal involvement means that MPS does a formal review of the project. And the original intent of that was, of course, to prevent additional damming of free-flowing rivers, and it has a wide-reaching effects with a range of development projects. And then in a more general sense, the Park Service or whatever the administering agency is can provide technical and financial assistance on a whole range of projects, and the cooperative agreement is the technical mechanism for that to the region. Some more benefits, again, in a general sense here before I get to White Clay Creek. So the opportunity to leverage additional grants, that MPS funding as a beginning to additional funding. as well as the local appointed Rivership Council is, this sort of rock of collaborative power around the protection of the river, with representation from state and local municipalities, nonprofits, municipal representatives, volunteers. Okay, so let's talk about White Clay Creek a little bit. And I know I just raced through a lot of the mechanics of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And we can, like I said, when we get to the discussion, feel free to chime in with your questions. We can certainly hit on more of those. So I should mention, I moved down to the region. I'm a native of Philadelphia, but I moved down to the region a year ago. And so, and during COVID, after working with Wild and Scenic in New England for 4 to 5 years. So I am also on a great learning curve about the region, about the state of Delaware, about White Clay Creek. It's been tremendously fun to get immersed. I'll do my best to represent all the great work going on. And, obviously we've emphasized this, but White Clay Creek really is a great example of the deep partnerships that form between the National Park Service and the local agencies and nonprofits. So talking to Shane, I asked her, what in your mind do you think the benefits of designation were for the region? And there are several programs that she believes just absolutely would not have happened without this partnership in place. One of those is, municipal outreach and combined with a long-term water quality program, monitoring program that the federal funds really kicked into motion. And, Jerry is deeply involved in that. He can certainly report more on that. But here's an example of all the sites deeply monitored over a number of years in great partnership with the University of Delaware and a whole range of partners that Shane and partners are very proud of. Huge boost to education and outreach. They do an annual White Clay Creek Fest, which these last 2 years, or last year and this year, are going to be virtual. They've sort of pivoted the way so many people have. Also a very collaboratively planned annual event. The Catch the Rain program, from my experience with Wild and Scenic so far, is so tremendous and really unique to White Clay Creek. So what she's done with the work of the council is build a program that incentivizes stormwater management with local landowners, private landowners. Since so much of the land along Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers is private land, and that's how the model developed to function. So this program in particular incentivizes that work by providing the technical expertise. Shane goes out to the property, looks around, talks to the landowner, and then there's a funding incentive. So the council budget provides some of the funds to do these smaller stormwater catchment and other types of restoration activities on private land. I know from my work in Massachusetts, one of the challenges is often, how to impact that private landowner in terms of really creating management change on private property. And I just feel like this council in particular and White Clay Creek has done a tremendous job. And certainly I know in Delaware, huge drainage issues for the White Clay Creek. And this is one approach to working on, some of those stormwater management issues. Some contact information for Shane and myself. We can come back to this. So again, I sort of breezed through some of those benefits to White Clay Creek because we have so much expertise in-house, and we can talk about that water quality monitoring program. We can take it apart some more, but there's more expertise on this call than just me. So I'm providing highlights, and we can go back to whichever pieces you want. So White Clay Creek is Delaware's only designated wild and scenic river. In a minute, I'm going to bring up some slides that I think originated with Fred. Obviously the first question as you think about potential other wild and scenic rivers in the region is the partnership model a good fit? These are some questions that we encourage thinking about, that local involvement piece. And I know that there are a number of partnership groups such as yourselves working in the region. What are the values along the rivers that you're trying to protect? Do you think you have receptivity from your congressional liaisons? Or representatives, I should say. So these are the slides I referenced. Fred, I think you did this one, is that right? Or maybe Paul? I'll let him chime in later.
Yeah, we did a presentation.
Yeah, that's a Fred GIS.
A couple of years ago.
Right, so, and you'll notice some of the backgrounds on these slides are different. Those White Clay Creek slides were from Shane herself. So here we have representation of the Fuller watershed that obviously, you know, you can't talk about what's going on in Delaware without this larger picture. Just tremendous wild and scenic representation, or I should say designations in the region. These are existing ones. Any work down here is part of that larger collaborative picture. I know you know so many of the individuals working in a range of agencies in the overall basin. Okay, so another Fred slide. So as we hone in on Delaware, this was mapping that some of your colleagues did. I just borrowed the slide. And the rivers that you see listed are the ones that were outlined in the National Rivers Inventory, which was a resource that was put together a number of years ago, looking at potential rivers for study, trying to make note of them before further development happened, and trying to encourage you know, progress in additional designations, which right now, I think the number, last time I looked, was less than 1% of rivers nationally are designated as wild and scenic. So there's so much more that can be done. So I think this slide does a nice job of showing the potential in the region, which is why I grabbed it. And we can come back to some of these. Rivers don't have to be in the National Rivers Inventory to be considered for study. I just had some conversations with the Lackawaxen River, which feeds into the Delaware around the upper Delaware designation. They're not listed in the inventory, but they have a conservancy and a group of partners accumulated who are all interested in potential study. And so we've started conversations there, just as an example. So as we think about the process, you know, identifying which river where there's local interest is a huge piece. The study involved in the process has to be designated by Congress, and that's where that piece of connecting to your congressional representation is so important. We like to talk about the first step really being that local buy-in and bringing partner organizations on board, working with the municipalities to understand that all of the private land management remains in the hands of private landowners and land management organizations and agencies. You know, that's what's at the heart of the partnership model. And sometimes that is an area where there's pushback, is this fear of change to local land management. So the first steps are that local buy-in of partners, and building awareness on the part of those congressional representatives. MPS is there all along the way to help advise. You know, I mentioned that Lackawaxen River example. Those folks needed some support in reaching out to their congressional representatives. And in fact, I connected them to Fred Akers and a couple of the other folks in the coalition, which I'll mention in a moment. I think we've covered this. I'll keep moving. So I just talked about this really having that vision among the local stakeholders and a sense of what the values are. You know, we use this term ORVs, outstanding resource values, and those get identified in the management plan work that happens. But they really have to resonate at local level as a start to the process. And I talked a little bit about the agency role. I think it's the collective work of these three categories of partners, let's call it, coming together to get a study authorized. The study could take up to 3 years, or really beyond. It's authorized for 3 years. When it gets approved by Congress, it does come with funding to help the process move forward. And I think one of the critical things as you think about the process is that we like to talk about how the study process itself has tremendous benefit. It's bringing together those agencies and groups to identify the values that they want to protect, working on that management plan and getting it in place to identify actions and projects and goals that those stakeholders want to work towards together. And so I've talked a little bit about Fred. These are a couple of resources. The toolkit online really discusses some of the ins and outs, has a number of resources about the study process, getting the study authorized. You know, it's at the end of the study, once you have your management plan that talks about the resources and the goals for management, that you then have to move into an additional authorization, moving the study towards actual designation by Congress. And we have so many resources available now. It's, you know, it's a little clunky. You have to poke around a little bit. Additionally, the group of partners, sort of a large family of partners. When you think about, we have 16 partnership rivers on the East Coast now. And Fred and others have done a good job of sort of cementing relationships as part of a larger coalition. There is a website now. That group is also a huge resource in partnership with MPS. And so that's it for my slides. I'm going to turn this off, but you know, you tell me which pieces of that you want to dig more into. And like I said, we can really tap into a lot of the knowledge here. You know, do you have specific rivers in mind that are part of the strategy for the state of Delaware? Are there programs that White Clay Creek is doing that you want to see in other places? What do you think is something that the designation could really help the state of Delaware progress with, whether it's water quality monitoring across the state or what have you? So those are some questions that come to mind for me, and this is an opportunity for me to do a lot of learning from all of you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Well done and great information overall. Does anyone have any questions for Sarah about White Clay Creek or the designations for wild and scenic rivers?
Yes, Sarah. Hi, Jerry. Just answer your question about which segments might be next. 1992, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And remember the National Park Service at the Gerald Ford Museum, Association of State Floodplain Managers. Chris Brown, National Park Service, gave a talk on multi-objective management of rivers and trails, MOM. And that was really interesting. That's one of the reasons I came to Delaware in 1994, because I heard about the White Clay Creek. So a big fan of that, particularly in the White Clay Creek as a nonpartisan intergovernmental way for the states to work together. So Mike Castle used to come when he was the governor, the congressman, and we couldn't find waders big enough for his feet up at the White Clay. We found them, but he was a big proponent. Of course, and Joe Biden, he was at later on. He talked about in his own good way about the Piedmont, that the best part of Delaware begins up in Pennsylvania, which was really a cool way to put it. And so, and then Joe Pitts was a Republican congressman just across the line who was for this. And it was Joe Biden and Fred and Representative Pitts that co-sponsored the legislation, went to Bill Clinton in 2000. So big fan. Our university sits right on the banks of the White Clay Creek. That's why we're involved in it. And Andrew and Martha are working with the students with Shane on the monitoring. And Andrew has produced all the maps, including the maps that were signed by Bill Clinton and also Barack Obama when the legislation was modified. So Andrew and I have been talking. Fred, you're the guy that gave me the idea at the Delaware Estuary Conference down in Cape May about the other segments. My mother lived for 15 years in South Beasley's Point, New Jersey. We call it Hickory Point. So if you look at my Twitter, there's a sunset photo of that on Sunday down there at the Great Egg. So big fan of what you're doing. But about the river segments that were done in the 70s. And we're doing a lot of work in the Brandywine now with Brandywine Shad 2020, the National Park now. And so it might be time to start thinking about the Brandywine as on that list, because there's a lot of things going on in the Brandywine. And if the White Clay Creek's wild and scenic, then certainly the Brandywine is, from Chad's Ford through the National Park down to Wilmington. And on the other part, Andrew, the Red Clay Creek is technically hydrologically the east branch of the White Clay Creek when you look at the map. The Red Clay Creek is nothing more than has red sediment in it, and the White Clay Creek has kaolin, which is clay. But hydrologically, it is the east branch, and it might be time to start talking about the Red Clay Creek as potential wild and scenic.
And I saw, yeah, I agree with that, Jerry. And I saw Matt had put in something. I had made some notes about rivers, and he had said downstate. But to me, if you're looking, you just start looking at the lowest hanging fruit, and that might be redesignating the wild and scenic that's already there. A lot of watershed partners, a lot of sort of NPS support, and existing programs that could potentially make it an easier lift to get at least red clay, you know, because you can argue, and it's not unprecedented to add segments to white clay.
Yeah, it would give it greater protection, because the White Clay Creek, it's interesting to talk about. That little creek supplies the drinking water for a full 1/5 of all of Delaware's population. That's 200,000 people are provided with drinking water from the city of Newark's intake, and then Suez, Delaware, down at the foot of the White Clay. And so that's another reason why, and half the watersheds in Pennsylvania. So over the last 21 years, the White Clay Creek has shown how good as an effort it is in a non-federalized way, I guess. We had the John Birch Society out in 99, 2000, came out in droves to Clayton Hall. They didn't want the federal presence on the river. So the National Park Service with Chuck and Julie, Sarah, your predecessors, they came up with this great partnership approach that Fred perfected over in New Jersey, where I was born. Where I grew up. So big fan of that. So I would argue for starting to study the red clay and the Brandywine when it's time. And then those beautiful tributaries down along the coast, like the Cedar and the Blackbird. There's a National Estuarine Reserve there that's protected under the EPA. So, you know, there's a lot of good things going, and let's take what works and take the next step.
And just as an aside, I'm associated with the Brandywine Red Clay Alliance, and I'm interested in kind of pushing that, and I think there is some traction there. So again, I'm not eliding the southern portions, because Blackbird Creek or Murderkill, Mispillion, Nanticoke, you know, they're great, but that's kind of what I've been thinking. And Sarah knows this. We had some discussions.
Yeah. And
I have a question, if I could ask you.
Yeah, Matt.
I'm not a core person in the Wild and Scenic program, sort of tangentially, you know, been familiar with it for a number of years. But Sarah, I was wondering, you know, and I agree with what both Jerry and Andrew said about red clay and Brandywine. I'm sort of thinking more downstate myself, just because I've been doing some work down there, and, you know, you guys kind of have this area covered. So I'm thinking about some places that might be down the road. You know, I've been working with Delaware Wildlands a lot along the Blackbird and Appoquinimink, which is kind of a complex together. And, you know, that marsh is one of the great untaxed ditch marshes. I think the only other one is Bombay Hook that hasn't been altered in some way as far as the tidal marsh communities. And I'm wondering if there's a process by which you could take two adjacent stretches like that. I mean, the Blackbird and the Appo are like a mile apart or less in places. Is there a way to designate two rivers if they're sort of part of one complex like that? How would that work process-wise?
Yeah, so part of the study process involves really looking at what are the reaches that would be, we use the words eligible and suitable for designation. So you have some time to really dig into that. And yes, there is definitely precedent for sort of connecting a few rivers within a larger watershed. In 2019, as part of the Dingle Act, we had 3 designations move through, and one of them in Rhode Island was the Wood-Pawcatuck watershed, and that was the Wood River and the Pawcatuck River I think there were a number of named tributaries too. And so they kind of, they came up with the nomener Wood-Pawcatuck watershed, and they pursued designation on a number of connecting rivers that had significance to each other. And I'm going to pause there for a minute. And my colleague Paul on the line in New Jersey, who has 3 rivers in New Jersey, has done a lot of work with sort of tidal rivers. I don't know if you want to chime in about anything, Paul, with regard to the process for more tidal rivers, marsh rivers, connecting segments. You're on mute.
Yeah, I have a good bit of experience both in studying a wild and scenic river and managing them. And I think what Fred's presentation concerning the NRI segments in Delaware is a really good start. And I think that, you know, I personally have interest in the Brandywine for a designation. And partly because the river has some really outstanding cultural resources associated with it. And for people in this meeting, it's important to realize that you only need one outstanding value to designate a wild and scenic river. And so it could be just cultural resources alone is enough to get Congress under the Wild and Scenic River Statute to go ahead and designate a river. And, you know, that's true with a couple of our rivers in the program. I think we have I know at least one river that's just designated based on recreation. So there are some rivers that could qualify in Delaware, at least make the eligibility. And I think the Brandywine at 6 or 7 miles are already on the NRI. And I think that's a river that could be ripe for review. And a couple things about the White Clay Creek I think is interesting. It's the largest single wild and scenic river designation in the East. It's the largest east of Wisconsin. And it's unique in that it's an entire watershed. So the designation itself and the watershed is one and the same. There is no other river like that in the entire wild and scenic designation realm. And we're talking less than 1% of America's river miles. So the White Clay Creek is pretty special, and it's a lot to handle. Sarah can attest to that. But I think, and those lower rivers downstate in Delaware are also prime candidates. I think some of them are fairly rural. So I think they would involve more ORVs than just say cultural resources on the Brandywine. So I think they could be considered too. And the Red Clay is a great stream. I've fished it many times. So all of these rivers, I think, are eligible. I think they would make good candidates. I think the watershed associations around them are growing stronger. And I think the CDRW is a good supportive base for that growth. So that's what I have.
Yeah, thanks, Paul and Sarah. I'm curious, we could, with the coalition support and our members backing, really support White Clay Creek more and expand that, or, grow that to other designations. And I'm curious from your perspective, is it strategic to do one or the other? Is there a way to do both? What are your thoughts?
Is that a question for me or Sarah?
Either, yeah.
Okay. I think in my opinion, the White Clay Creek has such a good record and is federally supported. And it's in a management mode primarily. And that's me speaking. Sarah may think differently, but and I think that you're probably CDRW and with the state of rivers and growth in Delaware would probably be better served if they wanted to support an effort to support a new river study effort, if there was local support for it. That's my thinking.
Great, that's super helpful.
Yeah, I would agree. White Clay Creek is just doing a tremendous job. Shane Morgan, the coordinator, working with Jerry and others. Some of those programs are just so strong. You know, I think over time, obviously there should be collaboration back and forth in terms of, you know, issues, very hot issues such as climate resiliency or emerging contaminants, or certainly communicating about issues and collective work on the bigger picture will be significant. But I think they are, per what Paul said, trucking along on some great programs. A group such as yourself that has, you know, entities from a larger region coming together, that really positions you to help move additional designations forward. And so, so that's agreeing with Paul, I guess.
No, I appreciate it. And I think that's a good clarity on maybe strategy moving forward for us.
Yeah, I could offer a couple of points. One of the things that I think you need to take a closer look at is the suitability part of the designation. So the eligibility involves the outstanding resource values and what's can, you know, show up as facts of being cool about the rivers. And one of the reasons I focus on the NRI is because that was an early effort to do that. So in Delaware, there's 19 segments on the NRI. That's 168 miles, and all of those segments have a narrative with values. But the suitability part talks to more about how will the rivers be managed if they were designated. So if you look at the White Clay Creek, that's already been determined to be suitable, and it has a management framework. So if there are tributaries that might be added, it's a lower lift to just determine the eligibility of those, because the suitability for management has already been established. So the challenge that I see is for new segments to be designated, new rivers to be designated, is to get at that suitability early in the thinking about it. And where that comes into play, and what I'm talking about is if you have municipal support. So if you can go to local jurisdictions and get them juiced about having a designation and some of the advantages of some federal funding and focus on water quality and stormwater management and green infrastructure, those kinds of things, if they can formalize that support in the form of resolutions, that is what members of Congress, I think, will be most inspired by. So everybody can kind of agree that, yeah, these environmental values or recreational values or cultural values are cool and worth protecting. But to get at how you do that, if people don't want it, Congress can't really do anything. But if people do want it, so the early advocacy is to try to find some local champions that could get the congressional ear that, yeah, this is a good thing and you should, you know, do something. You should get a study for this area because people like it and they want it and it's good for you. And also nice presentation, Sarah. That was cool.
Oh, thanks, Fred. I'm thankful for your slides. Yeah, so I just want to, and I appreciate your comments, Fred, and I just want to clarify. So these terms, eligibility and suitability, are some of the technical terminology we use in the study process and become parts of the document that's submitted to Congress. You have the study window to work them out, and that's why, you know, you get a few years. But I think what Fred is pointing to is you wouldn't want to start this process up where you had no receptivity of sort of local municipalities. You know, you have to have a sense that there are some municipalities and partners wanting to come together to talk about what would that sort of collective management work look like.
There is, I just, not to beat the Red Clay Creek horse too much, but the, a lot of groups, partnership, the Christina Basin Partnership and Brandywine Red Clay and the Christina Watershed Municipal Partnership have been working with a lot of the municipalities across the line in Pennsylvania. So I think there could be a lot of support up in Kennett Borough, Kennett Township, and some of the areas up there. And I know Matt lives in the red clay. So below the state line too, there could be quite a bit of support locally. So I was looking at, I put a map link in the chat if you wanted to look and see a lot of the streams. I mean, you know, the Blackbird complex is just amazing, and that would be great. But again, I think to Paul's point, it might be, you know, that's a bigger lift, and that, you know, you're starting a little bit farther down the road, or not as far down the road. But I just wanted to say that there is a lot of sort of probably support that could be engendered in red clay.
Yeah, another thing to potentially look out for is who would be opposed to that. You know, you would hope that there would be no opposition, but in other rivers, they were pushing along, moving along, and then, you know, like farmers opposed, or their, you know, property owners were afraid, or things like that. So you need to look for potential opposition and then figure out how to like deflate that in the early advocacy stages.
Hopefully DNS and Mount Cuba, hopefully they'd be okay. Fortunately, there's a lot of big landowners, so, you know, it's not as many. Might not get the, what was it, the John Birch Society coming out, hopefully.
No, we took care of them 20 years ago. Yeah, Joe Biden lives right next door to the Red Clay Creek. I think he walks his dogs over there by Hoops Reservoir in Mount Cuba. But why don't we study them all? I put that in the chat. Why don't we do a suitability study statewide, Emily and Sarah? It could be an informal study looking at the segments that are already on the NRI. Plus, we'd argue the Red Clay Creek as a trib, hydrologically a trib to the white clay. And, you know, parse this all out with the parameters that Fred's introduced. I agree with the coastal plain tribs, Matt. Those are beautiful, and there's already a federal presence there. The National Estuary Reserve is in NOAA, not EPA. Sorry about that. And we have the 2 national wildlife refuges there under U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And we have the Greater Delaware Estuary Program, which of course is EPA. So if one of the principles is to have a federal presence as a start, we've got that downstate. So let's study them all.
Great point.
Yeah.
When I first did the research on the nationwide rivers inventory, and I started looking at the Delaware Bay, I was like, holy smokes, there's like 19 tributaries on one side, and I think there's 17 in New Jersey. And as I looked at the ORVs on the New Jersey side, and I think maybe on the Delaware side, there were actually some wild values where some of those segments have no human access. And when I put it all together, I thought, you know, we need a big thinker here, somebody to just come in for a legacy and say, let's have the whole bay be the wild and scenic designation.
I think that's a great idea, and get another state involved.
Yeah, the other thing that comes to mind for me, which is, you know, going to be harder and be more down the road, but another cross-state partnership would be the Nanticoke. I did a lot of work when I used to work for Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and I did a lot of heritage surveys down on their stretch of the Nanticoke. There's some spectacular resources there. It's largely wild. It's navigable up quite high, and of course the headwaters are in southern Delaware. So that's just another one that I think we don't think about as much in this group because this is CDRW, but when we're talking about within the state, doing some sort of a partnership with Maryland on the Nanticoke at some point makes a ton of sense. Just wanted to mention that too.
I agree. And Matt, as you know, it's a third of the state is in the Chesapeake, the Nanticoke essentially. And
they're hydrologically linked through the C&D Canal. The Chesapeake's a tributary to Delaware.
True.
So real quick, one of the things we need to solve today is who's going to actually do the work, and or at least get some commitments. In Delaware Nature Society, we can absolutely liaison with the congressional office, but in terms of doing the on the ground stuff, we don't have the staff and we don't have the time. So part of what we need to is whatever plan we come forward, we need to work with CDRW to get volunteers to help out. because we'll liaison to the congressional office, but anything beyond that, we just can't do it. We need the entire coalition and CDRW to help out.
Well,
I was just trying to jump in with just a quick comment about that strategy piece. Thanks, which was to say that, you know, it doesn't have to be either or, but it does come down to, let's say you wanted to explore Red Clay Creek, but Matthew also wanted to look into some of these more tidal tributaries. You know, there's the need for that local champion. We often talk about the local champion. So all of you taking it on as a sort of coalition is significant, but also having someone, a nonprofit or an agency situated right there that can really begin conversations. You know, and those conversations take a while and they can be happening in two places as you're exploring two potentials. So, you know, so I think it's wise to think about capacity and, but just wanted to point out the local champions can be working away at the same time.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We have that in Nanticoke too.
Sorry. This is Paul. Yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. And I think that like interest in the chop tank in Maryland sort of seems to have fizzled for a Wild and Scenic River study. I think primarily because there isn't really a local not-for-profit that's spearheading the movement. And in every study that I'm aware of, there's usually a local not-for-profit that really is interested in it and pretty much spearheads the effort. And that's shown up time and time again. And one with good connections to local governments. And that really is, in my view, indispensable to a Wild and Scenic River study.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I was suggesting Blackbird Appoquinimink, is because possibly we could talk Delaware Wildlands and Kate Hackett and her group into sort of being part of that. And then, as Jerry has mentioned, in combination with the Blackbird National Estuarine Program, you've got two really solid partners there already working and already actually bringing federal money in, because we got a grant through the Delaware River Restoration Program this year for some work down there. And I think maybe more applications in the pipeline. So yeah, that seems like a good node to try to get some of those local folks focused while we're working on these Piedmont stretches that already have a lot of support baked in around them.
One of the things that I was wondering, and I need to be really upfront that I'm new to this conversation, is do any of the ones that the group is considering have any environmental justice considerations, or do they run through areas, like I'm thinking about the Brandywine in particular because it does, but do they run through areas that serve environmental justice populations? Because to me, that would bump it up in importance.
I don't think there's one that doesn't, honestly, Em. Thinking of Red Clay as it meanders through, you know, sort of chateau country, but down into Wilmington and Newport, and certainly the Nanticoke, and, you know, it's more of a rural area, but anything, you know, near Dover, there's just pretty much all these rivers tie a lot of different populations together, that's for sure.
Yeah, just this week I was dusting off an old proposal. CARES proposal was called, through EPA, which was one of the first environmental justice probably 10 years ago. We submitted an application to EPA to look at environmental justice in the Brandywine red clay, white clay. And the red clay is economically, demographically, probably one of the more diverse watersheds, center of the mushroom industry, high Latino population, upstream, surrounded by some of the most wealthy land in the East Coast up there, and as it flows down to Wilmington. So you have that right there in the Red Clay Creek, and you can make the case for the coastal plain tribs as well as they flow through the small towns there. The other case is Dennis Coker, chief of the Lenape people down at Leipzig, which is the turtle totem. That's one of the tribs on the National River Inventory, and we can't forget the indigenous people of America as well. So I think just volunteering the time we have left. We have some great grad students. You've met a few of them, Sophie, and boy, they need a project, and we have the initiative, like to volunteer. Andrew, we have some funds to put them right to work this summer. We're going to be adding another student from the AmeriCorps coming down from Vermont. So like to volunteer to do that and start assembling this under the purview of the Emily, your initiative, the Clean Water. And we won't need any funds to do it. We have the funds to do it. It could be a summer project.
And then eventually maybe to do, if there's a larger study, if this is a prioritization, maybe a larger study could get funding, maybe NIFWIF or, other funding to do the next phase.
Yeah. I like Fred's
Jerry's had experience. I was a little before my time getting that all set up.
We could tell you some stories. Chris Coons gave a great talk up in the White Clay about growing up on the banks of the white and the red clay, and he still talks about that, and that's really good. Why not all? I like Fred's idea, that watershed bay approach that would sweep all of them into the same, And so this initial, study would be not either or, it would just characterize the watersheds for their suitability. Yeah. As Fred says, they're eligible. And we'd have to look at the red clay, see if that can be added to the list. I'm sure you can. But let's just come out with, by the fall, a study of these tribs. And, we would discard any that aren't suitable, clearly. I can't think of any that are, actually. And we could add the Chesapeake. I know, Emily, our mission is the Delaware, and we love the Chesapeake. But we can include them as well. We're big fans of the Nanticoke. Andrew and I just got done a big economic study over there.
And have connection with the Alliance down there, the Nanticoke Alliance.
Yep.
I just want to make two quick comments. First of all, Em, I want to appreciate you for bringing in the question of environmental justice and let you know that the Park Service is kind of early on in its thinking, but eager to figure out how to support the study, making sure as part of the study that really all of the partners are brought to the table, who historically has not been part of studies, who could be involved. So we would welcome your help sort of really bringing that to the front of a study process. I just want to say Shane at White Clay is an incredible partner on some of those issues. I know she's actively thinking about communities around the White Clay that maybe have disproportionate flooding and climate resiliency, climate vulnerabilities, I guess I should say. And she's actively thinking about how to partner on some really interesting restoration projects. And so there are others out there thinking of it. I wish we had more examples within the Partnership Rivers program of really focusing on that, but it is a conversation happening up and down the seaboard. The other note was just to back at you, Jerry, to once again just sort of mention that you need enough in place to push for a study and sort of that local champion, but don't try to answer all the questions at first. You get those 3 years to really look at eligibility and suitability. So you got to have enough for this coalition to decide on some priorities maybe. And you got to have those local champions, and then you get some time, once the study is authorized. I'm sure your students will be very useful in documenting the resources along the rivers and pulling those partners together.
Yeah, sounds good, Sarah. Yeah, the grad students usually study for 2 years, so we have them for that. Unless they want to take a little bit longer, then it's 3 years. But it would fit nicely into that. And, it doesn't have to be too formal. The local champion, that's very important. Thank you.
I just finished dueling Hill Weeks, one with the National Coalition. And I think there was a consensus across agencies and the big nonprofits that are on the coalition, like American Rivers and River Network and American Whitewater, that now is a good time to promote wild and scenic designation. The Biden administration has, there's climate change themes that wild and scenic rivers are good at dealing with. There are Congress people out west that are beginning to bundle up gigantic wild and scenic designations. And one of the ways that Congress makes the sausage for wild and scenic is bundling things together. So if there's other wild and scenic things going on, especially if there's, it gets political. You have to realize this is a political thing too. So if there are Republicans that want wild and scenic rivers and there are Democrats that want wild and scenic rivers, that facilitates making it happen because they bundle things together and everybody gets something. So another thing I think I suggest is if you can find congressional staffers that will help, that are, you know, in their hearts are river people. They can, if you find them, they can talk to their bosses. They can give you advice on what the, you know, it gets pretty deep. So what the committees that would have to get involved with this, what those staffers need to make things happen. So there's a deep fabric there. And if you can connect with congressional staffers, they can help you promote and guide you for the suitability part.
Fred, we like to joke that Delaware has the best congressional staffers and congressional representation in the entire Delaware River watershed. We are really lucky. I'm confident we can work with them and bring them on board. We're very lucky. As Matt
I think
said,
Andrew Dinsmore's parents are pretty involved with DNS, right?
Andrew's father is on Ellie and mine's advocacy committee. So both she and I work with him. Yep.
Great. Well, lots of awesome ideas floating around here today, and really appreciate everyone's time and energy and thoughts in today's discussion. Lots of great things coming out of this. And I want to continue the conversation as well. So if folks would be comfortable developing some type of subcommittee within the coalition that focuses on wild and scenic designations, I think that's a great next step to kind of hone in on our priority and focus on, you know, what's needed moving forward as well. So we can continue to act as that convener if folks would like that. And certainly invite you all that participated today to that next discussion to kind of hone in a little bit more. Does that sound good in terms of next steps for folks?
Perfect. For me.
Awesome.
For you, Dave.
Awesome.
We've been around 1743 here at the university on the banks of the White Clay Creek. So we will be here.
And Jerry was delighted to hear that we get a summer of free labor. Thank you very much for that.
This is going to be a good match because we have some students that are eager to study this. Actually, we had a master's thesis done a couple of years on the White Clay Creek. So it's not only very good, but it's also great for education.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Sarah did put her email in the chat if you're interested in reaching out. Sarah will certainly invite you and Paul to future discussions as well if you're interested. But again, thank you all for your time and energy today, and we'll connect very soon to continue this energy moving forward.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
thanks
thank you.
everyone.
We'll see you soon. Take care.
Take care.
Bye, Em.
Sarah,
Bye,
thank
Kelly.
you.